I'm going to try to convince you that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., whose holiday and birthday we celebrated this week, and that Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, whose yahrzeit comes at this similar time, and they were united in friendship and the work that they did, that they were prophets, Nevi'im. And yes, I mean prophets like Jeremiah, Isaiah, and Ezekiel. A bold statement, I agree. But let's compare and contrast MLK and Heschel to these ancient great prophets. The ancients loved the people of Israel and God with a selfless fervor. The prophets felt great pain when this relationship between Israel and God became strained. The typical cause of this distance was often idolatry or straying really from the values of Judaism, which was justice and kindness and equality. When they started to mistreat each other, to have hatred for each other, the prophets started to feel pain because God was feeling pain. They were the conduits of God's feelings. And so their love for the people compelled them to speak up and to rebuke them and to tell them, you can do better. And they had an unending quest to reconcile God and Israel together. And then because of their love, they did so even when the people lashed out of them because they were daring to share the raw truth of what Israel was doing. And nevertheless, the prophets persisted with passion and perhaps even at great danger to their own personal lives. And tradition considers the words of God, because we say God speaks, but we don't really know exactly how God speaks. God doesn't have a mouth. So when we can say in the 21st and 20th century that someone heard the voice of God, if we see genuine feeling, who are we to question it? So if we look at the lives of Dr. King and Rabbi Heschel, especially as we hear in their memoirs and their words, I believe that they were prophets. In January of 1956, at the ripe age of 27, Dr. King already received a threatening phone call. You are going to be assassinated in just 3 days' time. He received this call at his house in the evening with his wife and firstborn daughter sleeping in the next room. He sits down at the table, his head down in pain, and he prays to God. Lord, I'm down here trying to do what is right. I think I'm right. I think the cause that we represent is right. But Lord, I must confess that I'm weak. I'm faltering. I'm losing my courage. And I can't let the people see me like this, because if they see me weak and losing courage, they too will become weak. At this point, no one would criticize for King, a young parent, for choosing to protect himself and his family. Yet he soon hears God's response. This is God speaking according to King. Martin Luther King, stand up for righteousness, stand up for justice, stand up for truth, and lo, I, God, will be with you, even to the end of the world. What was the source of that words? How do we say it was from God? I believe it's because God loved his people, King loved his people, and King loved God too much to quit. He had to selflessly pursue justice, to climb, in his words, the mountaintop. This despite the great risk. He knew his life was at risk from that point on until indeed it was put to the early end. Rabbi Heschel, too, was a prophet. He was born into Hasidic royalty. Hasidim's goal is to attain pure love. Love of people, love of God. Heschel was also born with an uncanny love of knowledge, and he had to leave Hasidism in his mind to pursue that knowledge, bringing the secular university, his love of people, and his love of God together. Heschel's doctoral dissertation was titled The Prophets. And Heschel's theory is that God has pathos, God has feelings, and that indeed the ancient prophets were the conduits of how God shared feelings with the people. God is searching for man, man is searching for God. Literally titles of books that Heschel wrote. Heschel flees Europe in 1939 just as the doors are closing shut, and the Hasidic Jewish world that he knew was destroyed. Like Ezekiel and Jeremiah, Heschel is now in exile. And like those great prophets, Heschel chose to preach a world of hope, healing, and renewal. Heschel met King in March of 1963 at an interfaith conference on religion and race. King the prophet speaks first, speaking truth to power, calling out clergy and synagogue and churchgoers for being too complacent, too self-righteous. In King's own words at that conference, the churches and synagogues have an opportunity and a duty to lift up their voices like a trumpet and to declare unto the people the immorality of segregation. We must affirm, King says, that every human life is a reflex of divinity, and every act of injustice mars and defaces the image of God in man. After those words, Heschel gets to get up and speak. And he too speaks like a prophet, referring back to the Exodus. He says, the first conference of religion and race was between Pharaoh and Moses. The outcome of that summit meeting has not come to an end, Heschel says. Pharaoh is not ready to capitulate. The Exodus began, but it's far from having been completed. In fact, it was easier for the children of Israel to cross the Red Sea than it is for a Negro to cross certain university campuses. 1963. Heschel goes on in that speech to declare racism is Satanism. We worry more about the purity of dogma than the integrity of love. To be arrogant toward humankind is to be blasphemous toward God. They're both saying the same thing. God abhors hatred. Religion is teaching love, not hatred. On that fateful day in March of 1963, a short-lived but extremely powerful partnership of prophecy is forged, perhaps like Elijah and Elisha. King and Heschel would spend the next 5 years telling Americans and the world what they needed to hear, not what they wanted to hear. And the more stubborn the people got, the louder they became. In the summer of 1963, Heschel essentially told President Kennedy, who wanted to quash the famous March on Washington, go take a hike. King is going to hold his march. And then in 1965, we have the pictures to show how King and Heschel walked arm in arm across the Edmund Pettus Bridge on the march from Selma to Montgomery, telling the world again that segregation is Satanism. And shortly before his assassination, King and Heschel pioneered opposition to the Vietnam War. Those who lived it was lived history for many of you, that view against the war was extremely unpopular. But Heschel and King were prophetically convinced that they were right and just. In hindsight, a decade later, we know that they were right to warn us of the dangers of the Vietnam War. We know what happened in 1968 in April, and Heschel died suddenly in the winter of 1972. We wish and wonder what could have been if their lives were not cut short first by assassination and then by illness. So I think we should dedicate this January and February's Black History Month to study and heed the words of modern-day prophets, Dr. King and Rabbi Heschel. We need to ask ourselves, are we being true to their prophecies? I want to conclude with a story of Elijah. Elijah the prophet, according to tradition, went up to heaven alive and continues to visit us and teach us how we should live in this world. In this story, a young, precocious child is asking his dad, "Daddy, when can I meet Elijah the prophet? He never comes on Passover when we pour a cup for him." His father, who happens to own a hotel, responds, "Be patient, my child." One night, the boy is left to care for the inn while his dad goes out. A poor man enters in. He's wearing dirty clothes, clearly weary from his travels, hungry and tired. "Please, dear child, I need a place to rest, a bite to eat." "No," the boy replies harshly, because his father taught him that these kind of people, low and dirty, don't belong in the establishment. Soon the father returns. "Any customers while it's gone?" "No, father, nobody came." "Are you sure, son?" "Well, a certain person that was poor and filthy came in, but I sent him away, as you taught me to do." The father was quiet, and for a moment he said, "My son, did you greet this man? Did you wish him shalom aleichem?" The boy shook his head. The father continues, "Don't you know that was perhaps Elijah the prophet who you wanted to meet? Why didn't you invite him to stay? Son, you need to make a habit for your entire life to greet all people by saying shalom aleichem, regardless if they're rich or poor, old or young. Maybe you are inviting in the Messiah." Words of prophecy from a father to his child, from Dr. King and Rabbi Heschel to us. Shabbat Shalom.